Ivan was alone in the castle. His wife, the fair and fierce princess, had gone to war with her armies. She had left Ivan just one instruction. He was not to climb the tallest turret of the tallest tower. Weeks passed, and Ivan grew bored. He remembered his wife's command, but his curiosity conquered all. Ivan climbed the tallest turret of the tallest tower. At the top, he found a chamber, and within, a starving prisoner. "Please, water." Ivan was moved by the sight and fetched a cup of water. The prisoner drank it all, but then he suddenly transformed, for the prisoner was none other than the dreaded Koschei the Deathless. "You fool!" he cried. "Now you will never see your wife again." With that, he bounded through the open window and swept like a whirlwind into the sky. And soon, he would have the princess in his grasp. If he was ever to rescue his beloved wife, a long and dangerous adventure lay ahead. Ivan's quest had begun. The story of Ivan and Koschei the Deathless is an old Slavic tale. But all human beings are storytellers. Throughout history and across civilizations, humans have told one another stories. Stories of good and evil, of great deeds and lost causes. Stories of our past, our futures, and who we are now. Stories are a way we explore what it means to be human. We live today in a culture saturated with narrative and story. But in the days before mass media, the internet, film camera, even the printing press, the need for story was no less. When the ability to read and write was given to very few, tales were spread by word of mouth. With each telling, a detail here might change, or something there might be forgotten and replaced with something new. And in this process of mutation, these stories became something else. Something not stemming from one mind or one pen, but something instead that was the product of a collective, of a particular people at a particular place and time. They became myth.
Myths tell us who we are. We use stories to explain to ourselves why we do things in certain ways.
They tell us about the part of ourselves that's emotion, that's not entirely rational.
Things can happen in myths on a much grander scale. Emotions are heightened, drama is heightened.
Myths tell us an awful lot about our desire for justice, the desire for truth, the desire for different sorts of virtues, and about how and why we go on journeys and what we actually do on the journey in order to return home.
It tells us what our values are. It tells us how we treat strangers, how we treat our family, how we worship the gods, what happens if we don't.
They are embedded in our cultural psyche, whether we realise it or not.
Few myths are more exciting than tales of great heroes and the foes they encounter in their adventures. Such heroic quests are found in tales from cultures across the globe and throughout history. But there are often striking similarities between such stories. The mighty warrior who's all but invulnerable to harm, the witches and wizards who help or hinder, the menacing giants, the beguiling temptations, the journeys into dark caves or into the depths of the underworld, all are found in tales from different cultures and different times. But what if there was more to these echoes than mere coincidence? That was the belief of an American mythologist named Joseph Campbell. From an early age, Campbell was obsessed with mythology. As a young man in the 1930s, he spent years examining ancient texts from around the world. It was in this period of intense study that a theory formed in his mind. It was a theory that would make him famous. In the countless stories that he read and analyzed, Campbell thought he spotted something. A pattern.
Campbell was trying to make a claim for a sort of universal human nature that can be appealed to by a certain kind of story. He laid out what he thought was the story that's common to all hero myths everywhere in the world.
Campbell believed that you could read this kind of mythological quest or the hero's journey throughout all of Western mythology.
As he engages with non-Western cultures, he develops this idea further until we get the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
The Hero with a Thousand Faces was published in 1949, drawing on the pioneering works of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and others. Campbell outlined the recurring stages he had identified in story after story, from culture after culture. He dubbed it the hero's journey. The Hero with a Thousand Faces became an unlikely bestseller, with a particular impact on the big screen. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, has credited the book with shaping his thoughts about the saga. And Luke's thrilling adventures follow almost every stage laid out by the hero's journey.
All heroes' journeys begin with the hero at rest in their home culture. So one particular stage is the call to adventure. An outsider figure comes and calls them to adventure, says, "Come on, Luke, you've got to go do something now and help this girl." He embarks on a journey into the unknown, a realm that's usually much more crowded with the supernatural.
The hero is tested in these strange surroundings and has to pass various trials in order to continue.
Within that realm, he meets various mentors and also various companion figures who become part of a sort of entourage that he travels around with. Typically, he then has a near-death experience type adventure where he plunges down into some kind of abyss.
But the hero survives this darkest moment and then achieves perhaps new knowledge or a treasure as a reward. And then he flees, pursued by the enemy.
From which he arises transformed, capable of fulfilling the quest on which he started out.
There's one final test, and that is often a moment of life or death. The hero has to use all the knowledge that he's gained up until this far to come through that and succeed. The end result is a new world, a new status quo that comes into being.
The Hero with a Thousand Faces became one of the most influential books in the 20th century. But how did Campbell's ideas apply away from the cinema screen? Does Ivan's battle with Koschei the Deathless fit the model? What about the other great adventures of mythology? Is every hero truly on the same journey? Or is Joseph Campbell's theory just another myth? We begin with Arthur, legendary king of the Britons, and the tale of the greatest quest his knights embarked upon, the quest for the Holy Grail. Stories of King Arthur have been told and retold for centuries. The legendary monarch was raised in obscurity far from court, but he proved his birthright by drawing the sword from the stone. And from his castle at Camelot, he went on to rule Britain with wisdom and justice.
King Arthur, for us, is a mythical figure, possibly based on a real-life figure from the 6th or 8th century.
The very earliest reference to Arthur is in a 7th century Welsh poem. It's quite a fun one, where a great warrior is described, and then it adds sort of ruefully, but he wasn't Arthur. It's that he seems just to be known as a warrior. He's not really being referenced as a king. But in the 11th century, a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth, obviously also from Wales, produces the first really sustained narrative about Arthur and the Round Table.
The history of the kings of Britain is a pseudo-historical account of British history, chronicling the lives of its kings over the course of 2,000 years, until the Anglo-Saxons assumed control of much of the island around the 7th century.
The problem with the history of Britain is that it's not completely factual. It's a real patchwork of various historical facts, certainly some fiction mixed in. So it's a real melting pot of influences that Geoffrey Monmouth puts into the history of Britain. The Arthur of mythology and the wonderful towers of Camelot stand very much, I think, for a vision of Britain that never existed, but perhaps one that a lot of people wish did exist.
It has all the hallmarks of the great epic, boy born in obscurity, magical figures, battles, it has knights, it has romance, it has tragedy as well, of course, and then it has this notion at the end that the king will return. That, I think, is comforting on some level, that in England's greatest need, this epic warrior will return.
So whatever you think a perfect king is, that's Arthur. What he's become is a British personification of the ideal king. And therefore that varies across different periods because people's idea of what they want from a king and what they want from a leader is historically quite variable.
Arthur was a great king, but even great kings sometimes need help. So too would Ivan in his quest to defeat Koschei the Deathless. Ivan journeyed on through forests and valleys until one day he came upon a wondrous palace hidden among the trees. As he neared its gates, he was watched from the branch of a lofty oak tree. For this was the home of the Falcon Wizard. Ivan explained his quest to him. The wizard knew of Koschei and the danger Ivan faced. He promised help if ever it was needed. Ivan continued on his quest. In the days that followed, he met an eagle wizard, then a raven wizard too. Both made the same promise to Ivan. He would need all their help to succeed in his quest and rescue the lost princess. Heroes cannot do it all alone. Sometimes they will have to rely on the wisdom and aid of others to triumph. And sometimes these helpers are in disguise, sometimes they possess magical powers, and sometimes they go on to become as famous as the heroes themselves. At King Arthur's side, through many of the stories, is a mysterious figure with magical powers, the wizard known as Merlin. He was the one who planted the sword in the stone, and it was he who brought Arthur from obscurity to claim the British crown. In popular culture today, Merlin is as renowned as Arthur himself. He is the archetypal wizard, the ancestor and inspiration for Gandalf in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars films. But magical helpers such as Merlin are found throughout myth and legend. Joseph Campbell recognized this. The supernatural aid is usually an older character. Their wisdom and guidance are needed for the adventure ahead. Often, too, they must give the hero the final push necessary to leave the ordinary behind and enter the special world. King Arthur and the wizard Merlin were once thought real historical figures. Over time, such beliefs faded. However, the stories themselves never went away. The development of the legend in the medieval era culminated in 1485. That year saw the publication of Le Morte d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur. 8 stories of the king and his knights, compiled from sources in France and in England. Here was the Arthurian legend complete. The author of the book was a man named Sir Thomas Malory.
Historical documentation tells us Thomas Malory was a thief, a brigand, perhaps even a sexual predator and a rapist, and that ultimately he was incarcerated in Newgate Prison in London.
We tend to associate the Morte d'Arthur with chivalry and with a particular interest in the Knights of the Round Table as defenders of women. So at first we might go, well, wait, why would a rapist write that?
It's this criminal aspect which has made critics wary of suggesting that this is the Malory who writes Morte d'Arthur, because they see a clear disconnection between his criminal behaviour and a text that seems to be about chivalry.
The Arthurian legends may have roots in more ancient folklore, but Malory's work is distinctly Christian. Religious symbolism saturates the text, and supernatural elements common in earlier versions are all but eliminated. In Malory's Christian Camelot, there is little room for the wizard Merlin and the pagan magic he represents. Even Arthur himself seems tainted by the association. For the holiest and most famous adventure of Le Morte d'Arthur centers neither on Merlin nor on the king he mentored. Instead, it is the Knights of Camelot who embark on this great adventure, the quest for the Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail in most mythologies is the cup Jesus Christ used at the Last Supper, in which he consecrated the wine and turned it into his blood. Later in legend, Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to have come along with this same cup and caught the blood from the wound in Christ's side.
That cup then will give immortality to those who then drink from it. Of course, immortality not just in the physical sense, but much more in the spiritual sense.
It becomes this holy relic with this really heightened significance, where it becomes something to be possessed at all costs, but something which only a few people can actually approach.
The knights were called to adventure in the most direct way. During a dinner at Camelot, the castle shook and a holy light filled the chamber. Then, the Grail itself appeared before Arthur and his knights. After the miraculous appearance of the Grail at Camelot, the knights Lancelot, Galahad, Percival, and Bors set out to retrieve it. Arthur mourned their departure. He knew the quest his knights embarked upon would change them forever, and that the fellowship at Camelot would never be the same. His knights left the ordinary world of the castle behind. Crossing the threshold, they entered the special world of adventure. Ivan had found his captive wife at last, but the demon holding her was too fast. Try as he might, Ivan could never catch them. Koschei the Deathless had a magical steed whose legs outpaced the wind. The exhausted Ivan finally gave up the chase. It was then that Koschei attacked. Ivan was no match for the strength of the giant. Koschei chopped him into pieces, bound him in a barrel, and pitched him into the sea. Far away, Ivan's wizard friends sensed his plight. They rescued the barrel and put Ivan back together again. He could never outpace Koschei, they said, not without a magical horse, and those could only be found beyond thrice 9 lands and a river of fire, at the home of the Baba Yaga. His quest was far from over. But at last, he knew how he could save his beloved wife and defeat the demonic giant. For a hero like Ivan to succeed, he must overcome a series of often dangerous tests. Joseph Campbell called this stage the Road of Trials. Here, these perilous, for an audience, exciting encounters challenge the hero, who is often aided by magical helpers or thwarted by new enemies. But with every victory and setback, our hero is learning and preparing for greater tests to come. road of trials was longer or more arduous than that faced by the hero of the ancient Greek epic, the Odyssey. Attributed to an author known only by the name Homer, it tells the story of the journey home of Odysseus after the Trojan War. He had been fighting at Troy with his fellow Greek kings for 10 years. Meanwhile, on his home island of Ithaca, the son he had left behind was growing up without him. Other men were eyeing his empty throne and Penelope, his unaccompanied wife.
Odysseus was the king of Ithaca, and he was known as being a very important hero during the Trojan War. He was the person who came up with the plot to get inside the walls of Troy with the Trojan horse, and was mainly known for his intellectual skill.
Odysseus is best described by Homer's opening line on him, the man of many minds, the man with the really rich inventive brain.
Odysseus was at war for a decade. Getting home, however, would take just as long. Such an extended journey was not Odysseus' intention, of course. He had planned to sail straight back home across the sea to join his wife and son in Ithaca. But as was often the case in the tales of ancient Greece, the plans of mortal men were at the mercy of unpredictable and often vengeful gods.
The Greeks have managed to alienate some very powerful deities by their incessant pursuit of Troy. And as a result of that, they've particularly angered the god Poseidon. And the god Poseidon pretty much ensures that Odysseus and his men aren't going to have a straightforward journey back to Ithaca.
One of the people he met on his journey was the Cyclops Polyphemus. And this is where the trouble starts.
He and his men are captured by the Cyclops, who's a big scary giant with one eye in the middle of his forehead. He starts eating Odysseus's men one by one, and eventually lets them go by mistake because Odysseus tricks him. But then it turns out that the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon.
Poseidon essentially is very offended at the outrage that's been done to his son and dogs Odysseus' steps all the way home.
Odysseus' journey became a lot more difficult. On his road of trials, he encountered hideous monsters, ravenous cannibals, a deceitful witch, together with all the wild and strange furies of the sea. Among them, of course, the beguiling but deadly sirens. These mysterious creatures lived in a meadow on a tiny island. Singing out to the ships that passed, they lured countless men to their shores, never to leave again. Odysseus knew all this, but wanted to hear their song all the same. He ordered his men to stop up their ears with wax and tie him to the mast. No matter how he pleaded, the men were not to release him, and they were not to stop rowing.
Homer doesn't tell us what the sirens look like. There's no physical description in Homer at all, until you hit some point in the medieval period, where suddenly you start getting many more illustrations of sirens as half woman, half fish.
When we think about how it is to live a life that's dominated by the ocean and by voyaging and by the physical apprehension of just how alien the ocean is, we want to put some flesh on that to tell a story about that, to tell a story about our fear and our longing. And to do that, we create something that's part ocean and part us, and that's the mermaid.
Mermaids date back to the Assyrian cultures of 1000 BC, but are common to folklore around the world. They are usually depicted as young and beautiful. However, much like the sea itself, mermaids can help or hinder. The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen is a story of the kinder sort. Published in 1836, the book tells of a young mermaid who saves a human prince from drowning. Falling in love, she trades her beautiful voice to a sea witch for a potion which transforms her into a human. But winning the prince's heart proves far from easy. Anderson's kind heroine is unlike many other mermaids, however. In British folklore, the creatures brought bad luck and were said to taunt sailors in doomed ships. Slavic mermaids were also dangerous. They were called Rusalkas and were the spirits of the unhappy dead. Beautiful and damned, they lured young men into the waters to drown beside them.
Worth remembering at this point that hardly anyone could swim in the pre-industrial world. Therefore, all cultures produce this phenomenon of terrifying emanations that represent death at sea. People tend to imagine sailors loving the sea. Actually, they don't, and all the folklore shows they don't. They distrust it, and they find it terrifying and unpredictable and scary.
This is way before we've got electronic navigation. This is in the early days of shipfaring, where you have to stay close to the shore because if you get too far out, you're in trouble.
It's well worth remembering how horribly physically impossible long voyages were in the past. So if you were at sea for more than 3 or 4 weeks, scurvy would have started to set in. And scurvy affects your mental processes. It makes you hallucinate, makes you see things that aren't there, makes you interpret what you see in frightening hallucinogenic type terms.
Could these hallucinations be the cause of such visions of sirens and mermaids? We will never know for sure. Odysseus sailed on unharmed from his encounter with the sirens, but they were far from the only female threat he faced on his journey home. To reach his wife Penelope, Odysseus had to outfox the witch Circe, who had transformed his men into pigs, and he had to flee imprisonment by the nymph Calypso, who desired him for her husband.
The threat from a lot of the female antagonists that Odysseus encounters is they set up rival places to dwell. The fact it takes him so long to wrench himself away from Circe, the fact he has to endure staying with Calypso, all reinforces just how much that nostos, that return home, is so important.
Of course, Penelope is being constantly hounded by different suitors at the court. So I think there's a mirroring effect there, as that when Odysseus is moving through his journey, of course, he's then got to also be assailed by these various women.
One thing that scholars have said about the Song of the Sirens is that the language that's used and the way it's phrased in the original Greek feels much more like it's been a passage taken out of the Iliad. That in a way the sirens are actually trying to call Odysseus back into the previous poem, into being a previous sort of hero, the sort of hero of the battlefield. And that part of his temptation is to go back to that form of heroism, which now the Trojan War has ended, there's no place for anymore.
Once a hero such as Odysseus has negotiated the trials, seen off temptations, and survived it all, he is ready for one final ordeal. The object of the quest is within reach. One more challenge lies ahead. The greatest he must endure. Hungry and faint, he walked on and on. Until at last, Ivan came to the house. 12 poles stood in a circle around it. On all but one was stuck a human head. This was the home of the Baba Yaga. "You've come for my horses," said the old woman. "Well, you can take one if you're fast enough. I'll give you 3 days to find them. Fail, though, and I'll put your head on a spike." Ivan had no choice. The Baba Yaga's mares, however, were just as fast as promised. They hid from Ivan in every corner of the woods. It was only with the help of friends made and lessons learned on his quest that Ivan succeeded. At the end of the 3 days, he left the enraged Baba Yaga on the back of a new steed. Ivan willed the magical creature on towards a reunion with the princess and a final confrontation with Koschei the Deathless. The ordeal is the greatest test of the hero. The risk of failure or even death hangs over them. Ivan survives the ordeal and is rewarded, and in other tales, the hero must slay a minotaur, journey to the underworld, or, as in the Icelandic saga of the Volsungs, survive an encounter with a great and terrible dragon. The Volsunga saga dates back over 1,000 years. It tells of the rise and fall of the ill-fated Volsung clan, their encounters with the gods, and their triumphs and defeats in love and battle.
Volsung Saga began as a series of separate tales that told individual high-born families of their associations with a heroic past.
The earliest evidence for the saga are from the 7th and 8th century.
We know these stories are being told even around the year 1000 because there are runestones in Sweden.
The culture of the states that produced Volsung Saga, it's a culture of warriors, it's a culture of voyagers, it's a culture that hugely privileges male adventurousness and male willingness to take enormous risks, and therefore it produces a hero that's also very extreme.
This hero was Sigurd. His father had been killed in a battle with the god Odin, so the young Sigurd was raised by a dwarf master blacksmith named Regin.
Sigurd is someone that medieval audience could aspire to be like in terms of his humility and his wisdom.
He is one of those figures that, like many heroes, connects the gods with the human. But he comes also to represent, very importantly, not only the interface between humans and the gods, but also the interface between human beings and wild nature. As he evolves, he becomes more and more about being a kind of wild man. What would a man be like if he wasn't ever civilized, if he wasn't ever subject to being taught and brought up and taught codes of manners?
The villain facing Sigurd in the Volsunga saga is a creature named Fafnir. Fafnir was the brother of the dwarf Regin, but his lust for gold corrupted him. He murdered his father and stole the family treasure. Obsessively guarding this vast trove deep in the mountains, over time he transformed into a dragon. Dragons are found in stories across the world, from ancient texts of Greece and China to the epics of Persia and later tales of Christianity. But every culture's dragon is different.
The Germanic dragon seems to be particularly into treasure. And I think this is an association with the quintessential idea of the good ruler.
The best thing a lord can be is generous. So if you want to do a good epithet for a good lord, you call him a ring giver. Obviously, the dragon represents the exact opposite of that. He's keeping all the treasure for himself.
Fafnir can be seen to represent the worst aspects of greed. He hoards this treasure in a way that it can't be used by anyone. It can't be put to use by a good ruler who would share it among his men and ensure that society functioned well.
Sigurd is sent to kill the dragon Fafnir by his foster father Regin. Near the dragon's lair, Sigurd finds a great trench carved in the earth. For every day, Fafnir is leaving his treasure and slithering down to the river to drink. Sigurd digs a hole in this trench and waits for the dragon. As Fafnir passes above, Sigurd thrusts his sword up into the serpent's belly. Fafnir is defeated. But it is not the treasure alone that Sigurd wins.
He tastes some of the dragon's blood, and as soon as the dragon's blood touches his tongue, he can understand the speech of birds.
That really just brings to the fore the way that Sigurd is destined to be a part of the wild. It enables him to live in the wild as if it were his society.
The reward quickly proves useful. Birds are chattering in the trees above. Sigurd soon realizes that they're talking about him. His foster father, Regin, the birds say, is plotting to betray Sigurd. His adventure is not over yet. Sigurd's story and the Volsunga saga do not end with the defeat of Fafnir, nor does the hero's journey. Once the object of one's quest has been achieved, there is the return home. And coming back can be as adventurous and as dangerous and as thrilling as setting out in the first place. Ivan and the princess raced away from Koschei. The demon, however, was close on their heels. But Ivan would not be defeated this time. Just as Koschei was closing in, Ivan swung his club high and hard. Koschei the Deathless was dead. Ivan's quest was at an end. His beloved wife was safe at last. The giant's body burned on a pyre. As Koschei's ashes scattered to the winds, Ivan and his princess returned on their magical steed to the castle in the woods. There they ruled in peace and happiness forevermore. Successful in returning from the special world, our hero returns not only with the object of his quest, but with the newfound wisdom and self-knowledge required to build a better life. A new status quo is born in the ordinary world. And so the hero's journey comes to an end. Several decades have passed since Campbell first outlined his theory. Storytellers from Hollywood and beyond continue to be inspired by it, and it's helped shape modern thinking about the origin of myth. But Campbell is not without his critics. Scholars continue to debate the merits of his theory, and there are many other lenses through which to examine mythology's roots and meaning.
All these mythologies were developed by societies for a really wide variety of different purposes, other than simple entertainment. They were often developed to teach people very complex moral lessons about being members of particular cultures.
When we're thinking about myths, we do have to look at the particular culture they've grown out of, because they do tell us something about the nationalistic background or the cultural background of these particular indigenous peoples.
If you look underneath and pay attention to the cultures themselves and start looking at the context in the broader world they live in, they're just far more interesting.
The idea of a common humanity reflected in the hero's journey remains an attractive one in an often divided world. But as this series will show, the realm of myths and monsters is far too strange and fascinating for one model to contain. In the long history of humanity, and in the deep recesses of our collective imaginations, there are far more stories for us to explore. Stories of magic and wonder, of love and betrayal, of sacrifice and cruelty, of the world we know, and the great mysteries that lie beyond. Today, the significance of the wilderness and a journey into it can be hard for us to appreciate. As populations grow and travel and communication become ever faster, we can overlook how different the world was in the past, how vast it must have seemed, and how wild. For thousands of years, most people lived and died within a short distance of the place they were born. Their existence was bounded by the wilderness, by the unyielding darkness of ancient woods, by the ice-shod peaks of impenetrable mountains, and by the hostile desert's lonely wastes. A journey to the next town was a perilous undertaking. It meant abandoning the safe and the familiar, and entering a realm that was not their own.
The wilderness is usually defined as somewhere that is uncultivated, uninhabited by humans, and it's often a liminal space.
Wildernesses are the places you don't know, the places where you don't go, the places where you have no business to be. They are the spaces of darkness.
What counts as wild and what counts as natural is very much a human construct. We decide where the wilderness starts and where it ends. So that question makes it a very fertile place for stories to happen as human cultures work out where those limits are.
You confront difference, you confront a world that's not your own, you confront the unknown.
It's dangerous and it's disordered, but it's natural and it's free as well. And this is really, in many ways, the perfect setting for what's going to happen in a myth or a legend.
People will fill the wilderness that surrounds them with what they fear in themselves, what they fear in their own society. The wilderness is the place where we expel all the stuff we don't like in ourselves, in our culture, in our society.
Such is the contradiction of the wilderness. It is both of us and not of us, surrounding us, yet at once strange and far away. For wilderness is as much an idea as it is a physical place, and a great deal can be learned about a people from the way they saw it, and from the stories they told about it. As much as people must have feared what lay beyond their walls, they also relied upon it. Seas threatened the fisherman with drowning, but they provided his livelihood too. The forest hid all manner of danger, but that was where the hunter had to roam. The trees can hide more than deadly creatures and lawless men, however. As the ancient story of Actaeon tells us, magic and madness can lie in wait should we ever stray too far from the path. Actaeon had wandered far from home. The young huntsman had long since passed the city gates, and the fields where farmers, thumbing sweat from their brows, had stood to track his progress towards the darkness of the woods. Actaeon did not fear that wilderness. He scorned the superstitions of other men. The forest, he thought, was as much his realm as the city street. As Actaeon rested in a shady clearing, he suddenly heard an unfamiliar sound. Drawn on by the strange music, Actaeon pushed deeper and deeper into the ever-thickening forest. He parted the last branches and stared into the grove beyond. The story of Actaeon is a classical myth. To the ancient Greeks, the young huntsman was courting danger the moment he stepped beyond his city walls, the moment he entered the wild. For the Greeks, human life revolved around the city. Athens, with its resplendent temples, was the birthplace of democracy. In its golden age, it became a flourishing center of art and philosophy. Socrates and Plato called the city home, as did the great playwrights Euripides and Sophocles. Their works helped shape Western literature and thought, and they are still read, debated, and performed to this day. Athens was not only a cultural powerhouse, it had military muscle too, with a navy which dominated the Aegean Sea. This supremacy was not unchallenged, however, for Athens had a rival, another great city of ancient Greece. Renowned for its austere discipline and the skill of its hoplite warriors, Sparta was more than a match for Athens. The long war between the two great cities consumed the ancient Greek world and ultimately ended the golden age of Athens. Cities such as Athens and Sparta were the human realm. What lay beyond belonged to something else, however.
The ancient Greeks just didn't like the wilderness much, so they were profoundly unenthusiastic about anything that we would see as wilderness. They simply saw it as somewhere that you didn't want to be.
The Greeks have this view that if you're out in the wilderness, there's always this risk of walking over the boundary, of crossing into the divine.
The Greeks regarded the wilderness as so scary that the god they created to inhabit it, the god Pan, is the god from whose name we get the English word panic.
It's about the crossing in between the wild and the tame, the controlled, the uncontrolled. So there's the possibility of crossing over that line and going beyond where you should go.
It's interesting that the gods always seem much more comfortable in the wilderness than human beings are. It therefore follows that human beings who are usually out doing something like hunting, something that's very much about conquering the wilderness, usually ends badly. It's almost a way of saying, know your place, which is one of the great Greek sayings. Know that you're not a god, you're just a human being.
There's a very real sense for the Greeks that that boundary between where humans are and where the divine is very thin. And if you're out in the wilderness, if you're out in the wild, you can just drop through it without meaning to.
To the Greeks, the wilderness was a frightening place where the laws of society held no sway. It belonged instead to the divine, to the monstrous, to the mad. It was a place of taboos broken and punishments terrible. It was everything a city was not. As such, it fulfilled an important role for the Greeks. By exploring what lay beyond the boundaries of society, people defined what lay within them as well. By telling stories of the monsters outside, they better understood those within. Actaeon stared into the grove. It was a wooded cave, wild and beautiful to behold. He was enraptured. He could not resist. He had to get closer. Actaeon crept forwards down to the water's edge, drawn on, ever on by the sight before him. His foot broke the stillness of the crystal waters. The ripples spread. Suddenly, dark eyes turned on the intruder, for those were no mortal creatures. This was the goddess Artemis and her nymphs, Artemis of the wilds, of the hills, of the moon. The goddess stood, cloaked in her wild fury. Actaeon ran. Actaeon's encounter with the goddess Artemis would not have surprised the ancient Greeks. For them, the wilderness was no place for man. The Greeks were not alone in seeing the wilderness as an otherworldly realm. Centuries later, the Celts of northern Europe would also sense in their great forests and rugged landscape the presence of the supernatural. The Celts were a pre-Christian people. Their origins in Central Europe date back as far as the 9th century BC. At its height, Celtic culture spread as far south as the Iberian Peninsula and as far east as modern Turkey. Celtic religion was a polytheistic one. The worship of its many gods was led by the Druids, mysterious figures of great social importance. They made prophecies, dispensed justice, and performed religious rites that may even have included human sacrifice. Celtic society and the age of the Druids was threatened, however, by the growth of the Roman Empire.
Most of our sources for the Celts are Roman sources, unfortunately, rather than surviving Celtic sources. The Celts didn't write their stuff down and the Romans did. So we have Julius Caesar's horrified account of Celtic sacrifices in oak groves, and oak groves with bits of sacrificed people hanging off them. So that's the first encounter between the Romans and the people that they came to call the Celts. And it's an encounter fraught with horror and dismay.
Interestingly, the Romans never called the Celts Celts. They call them Gauli, Gauls, or Britanni, Britons, basically. So they don't actually use the term Celts. So clearly they were aware of this slightly disparate group, which was nevertheless pressuring on their desire to establish a huge empire.
The Roman authorities suppressed the Druids, who disappeared from the written record in the 2nd century. Much of the Celts' unique cultural heritage was preserved only as an oral tradition, and so it was lost, along with the Druids.
The Druids were a challenge for the Romans because they were very, very secretive. They didn't like even writing down what their beliefs or their rituals were, and that was a problem.
The Romans found it very hard to get to understand what it was that they were facing. Faced with all that secrecy and denial, they decided that the easiest thing would be to get rid of it completely.
The Romans' attitude to the Druids was the same as their attitude to any group that they were going to take over. If there was a locus of power in that group, it had to be suppressed.
By 500 AD, the once widespread Celtic people are to be found only in northern Europe, in parts of Britain, France, and in Ireland. There, some ancient traditions survived, to be recorded by later Christian writers of the medieval period. Stories of the gods they worshipped, of the kings they served, and of the wilderness that surrounded them. The Giant's Causeway on the coast of Northern Ireland is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its 40,000 geometric rock columns reach heights of over 10 meters, and they stretch from the cliff edge to the sea and beyond. We now know them to be the result of ancient volcanic activity. But the Celts had another explanation. To them, the causeway was the work of legendary giant Finn McCool. He was challenged to a fight by a Scottish rival, so built a great bridge of stone over the sea, so the two could meet without wetting their feet. Alongside that wilderness of rocks and trees, however, there was another, more magical realm to be discovered in the lands of the Celts, the other world.
The Celtic otherworld was a supernatural realm, a realm that existed alongside of our own and parallel to our own.
It's a world that has its own laws, inhabitants, power structures, and nature. It's like something that's always there. It doesn't go away. So it's very much located in the outside, the beyond, the wild.
A glimpse might be seen in the clouds or the fleeting mist, in the half-light or in the shadows. It was at once both here and somewhere else. Stories of humans entering the elusive realm are found throughout Celtic mythology. Sometimes heroes were enticed in by a beautiful fairy maid, or they stumbled across an entrance in a cave, or under the water, or in a dream. The other world they found beyond was home to the many pre-Christian gods of the Celts. It was a land of eternal youth and beauty, where it was always summer, and there was no hunger and no despair. The realities of life for most Celts were sickness and starvation, war and want. The other world must have offered an attractive mirror image of those struggles. However, the price the other world extracted could be hefty too. Just as in the tales of the ancient Greeks, these human encounters with the supernatural did not always have a happy ending.
The Celts managed the wilderness by peopling it with entities that are somewhat like themselves. On the other hand, those entities are, more often than not, at least potentially very dangerous.
The realm of the fairies is superficially attractive, it seems quite glamorous, but often when the hero's in there, they discover that there's another side to it. Initially, the character who stumbles into the other world finds it a sort of glorious and happy place. But generally, the longer the character stays in that other world, they realise that it's more sinister, that it's got darker dimensions.
Let's take the beautiful fairy lady, who's perhaps the most typical issuer of an invitation to the Celtic otherworld. In Irish mythology, she's usually well-intentioned and usually won't do any harm in and of herself. But there's still a problem, because if you spend 3 days with her, it'll be 3 years where you came from. If you spend 3 years with her, it'll be 300 years. So when you go back home, everybody you know will be dead.
The principle of life is change, and we often regard that as a frightening thing because we don't want to grow old, we don't want to die. But yet the idea of the fairy realm suggests that the opposite is also quite horrific, that if we didn't grow old, if we stayed static, then there would be no growth, there'd be no life.
For the heroes of Celtic myth, entering this fairyland meant abandoning home and family. By their return, though, the world had changed, and there was no place left for them in human society. The stories seem to recognize that shared suffering and ultimately shared mortality are necessary for society to function. For where there is suffering, there is also kindness. And where there is death, there is a need for new life. Actaeon heeded not the rocks underfoot, nor the branches clawing at his tunic, slashing at his face. But he could not escape the goddess's rage. Actaeon had intruded, as no mortal should, upon the realm of the divine. He would have to be punished. As he ran, the bones of his face began to split and reform. Actaeon stumbled, his whole body taut with pain. Antlers burst through his skull. He tried to scream, but a stag's harsh cry had displaced his human tongue. The dogs he had left behind stirred from their rest. That familiar scent. It quickened in the mouth of every hound. Excitement quivered through the pack. A stag. The hunt had begun. Actaeon is transformed from man into stag. His dogs change from loyal companions into fanged predators. The transformation of these dogs strikes at a very human anxiety. Our communities are ordered. Laws govern our behavior. Crimes are punished. But in the natural world, it can seem that chaos reigns. Like Actaeon and his hounds, our grip over the wild is only ever a tenuous one. Some things are beyond our control. We are all times exposed to the random ferocity of nature. Oceans cover over 70% of the Earth's surface. Almost every civilization in history has exploited them for food, trade, or transport. But if the waters brought opportunities, they also represented danger.
You were at the mercy of the wind and the storms. Leaving view of shore was a very dangerous undertaking that only very experienced sailors took.
It's quite normal for sailors to be scared of the sea. It's not the case that people who cross the sea are comfortable with it or at home with it. It's actually normal, the more time you spend with it, to distrust it. Even experienced sailors, even experienced mariners will be caught by surprise by the behavior of waves, by currents, by weather.
It was not just the wind and waves that sailors feared. Throughout history, there have been tales of strange creatures living in the cold blackness of the deep. The serpents of the mid-Atlantic which stalked ships of the Royal Navy. The vast devil whales seen by early Irish explorers. And of course, the famous monster of Loch Ness in Scotland. None, however, is more terrifying than the creature said to dwell off the frozen coasts of Norway and Greenland. The King's Mirror, an old Norwegian manuscript from the 13th century, spoke of a creature that had never been caught. A beast so large, sailors mistook it for land, an enormous being which devoured fish, men, and even ships whole. They called it the Hafgufa.
The Hafgufa is a sea monster that appears in the saga of Arrowod. This sea monster is enormous and spends most of its time below the surface level of the sea. So all you ever see of it is its nostrils and its fangs. And when it comes to the surface, it looks like two big craggy rocks sticking up out of the sea. Its name is made up of two elements, the Old Norse words for sea, haf, and gufa, which is steam or vapor. So perhaps it's something about this monster's breath as it comes to the surface, looking like sea mist.
It's a sort of sea-going nightmare that illustrates the way that the ocean's depths are the ultimate wilderness, the ultimate unknown space.
The stories circulated among fishermen and traders of the north for decades. Some likened the creature to a giant crab. Others said it was more like a squid with enormous tentacles that ensnared boats and sailors alike. All agreed, though, that not even the greatest ships of war could resist its attack. Over time, a new name emerged and stuck. The beast was dubbed the Kraken. In the 18th century, new scientific disciplines emerged. Many natural philosophers dismissed the Kraken as a fisherman's tale. But others were not so sure. Swedish zoologist Carl Linnaeus described it as a singular monster of the Norwegian seas. Danish bishop Erik Pontoppidan believed the stories too, but claimed the true danger lay not in the creature, but in the deadly whirlpools left in its wake. Modern science gives more credence to the stories than you might think. The legend of the Kraken may be a result of sailors encountering a giant squid. These unearthly-looking creatures rarely come to the surface, but can grow to enormous lengths of 13 meters and more. And it is thought even larger squid, as yet unknown to science, lurk in the inky depths.
If you see a giant squid and you're in a very small boat, that's a terrifying experience. They are unnatural looking. They have the largest eyes in proportion to any other animal. So they look incredibly powerful. Also, they can do magical things like squirting ink out of their bodies. So there's a lot of discomfort associated with that kind of creature. And they therefore figure very often in horror stories. I mean, there's one in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. There's one in Victor Hugo's book, Workers in the Sea. They often figure as man's opponents, a kind of personification of the ocean itself in its unpredictability, its enormity, and its power.
Terror and confusion at seeing such a creature may have been intensified by the condition of the sailors themselves. Hunger and malnutrition were commonplace on ocean-going ships of the past. The sailors' work was hard, and they were confined to the same small space with the same people for week after week. The combined effect all this could have on their physical and mental health was devastating.
I think if you spend hours on a ship looking out at sea as a lookout for land or for any other vessels approaching, you're going to start seeing things in the light and the water and their interaction.
It's natural to give a reason for the odd behavior of the ocean. It's in a way easier to deal with it with a bunch of superstitious and mythological interpretations than it is just to throw up your hands and say, we don't really know why it works the way it does, but I'm going out sailing again next weekend. It's much better to think in terms of sea monsters that will make a good story.
Whatever the roots of the Kraken, the tales proved enduring. And we've not lost the taste for such stories. The ocean retains its power to frighten and to enthrall. In 1975, director Steven Spielberg scored box office success with his killer shark movie Jaws, and the formula remains a popular one. For taking to the seas to sail or to swim is still to enter the unknown. For who can say what might be sharing the waters with us? What might be lurking beyond the boat's hull or beneath our kicking feet? Though today, ships cross our oceans with satellite precision, the fears provoked by open waters and the unseen depths below have not entirely disappeared. The wilderness of the sea remains a dangerous place. And in modern tales of killer sharks and the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle, we can still hear the echo of the Kraken's roar. For thousands of years, Europe was cloaked in forests. Even the largest of its settlements and cities were mere pinpricks of light among a vast wooded darkness. It should be little surprise then that the forest is a common setting in the continent's myths and legends. It was both mysterious and familiar, dangerous, but within touching distance of home. It was a place of magic and adventure, a wilderness that lurked all too accessible at the bottom of the field or beyond the city gates.
The wood is one of those wilderness spaces in which scary things that you've never met before and can only imagine might lurk.
Forests do tend to have a particular value in the profile of that particular culture.
Forests are the places where the people who haven't succeeded in the arable lands end up. They end up there because they can afford to live there, because nobody owns the forest. You can't stop them from living there. They're therefore associated with the fear of not making it, with the fear of failing your family, your children, failing to provide.
Among the most famous stories of the forest are the fairy tales collected by two German academics in the 19th century, the brothers Grimm. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were born in Hanau in central Germany in the late 18th century. Their childhood was one of comfortable affluence until the death of their father in 1796 plunged the family into poverty. This traumatic upheaval affected the young brothers deeply. Relying on each other for support, the two became inseparable. Both excelled at school and went on to attend the University of Marburg. It was here that their interest in folklore began. It was an interest that would become an obsession, one that would dominate both their lives. Building on the work of French academics such as Charles Perrault and Baroness d'Aulnoy, the brothers began a patriotic project to collect the folk tales of their own land. They spoke to German peasants and aristocrats, farmers and city dwellers, and documented the stories they heard.
The Grimm tales were collected from people who lived in Hesse, which, though it was quite industrialized by the Grimm's time, had a lot of woods in it.
About 10 or 11% of the United Kingdom is covered by what we would call woodland. In Germany, even today, it's something like 35%. So forests are everywhere. Now, there's a particular reason for that, which is that the Germans place a high esteem on unspoilt nature. That's simply a cultural given. And that means that in some ways, Germans value a radical encounter with otherness represented by the forest in their renditions of fairy tales.
Their stories handed down by families who lived among those woods and who often lived very difficult and impoverished lives.
The Grimms collected stories from a whole range of sources. In the main, from middle-class bourgeois friends and neighbours and people in their own social circle. They'd often take several different versions of the same story, take the bits they liked, cannibalise them in effect, and combine them into a new story.
They were adapting the tales, of course, for an educated, literate public, a middle-class and aristocratic public, and they were adapting the content of those tales, of course, to the expectations of that public.
In 1812, the Grimms published the first volume of their children's and household tales. 3 years later, the brothers added a second volume, forming what we now know as Grimm's Fairy Tales. After its initial publication, the brothers spent the next 4 decades revising and expanding their collection. The 7th and final edition of 1857 contained more than 200 stories. Many of those tales are now familiar to us all: Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, and many more. The Grimm's enterprise was not simply an act of scholarly record, however. Over the years, the brothers rewrote many of the stories themselves. They minimized sexual elements and softened other darker themes. In earlier versions, Little Red Riding Hood was eaten by the big bad wolf. Sleeping Beauty was raped, not kissed. And Hansel and Gretel were neglected, not by their evil stepmother, but by their own parents.
I suspect that violent and abusive culture directed towards children may unfortunately have reflected not a social reality, but a social fear. We tend to credit other people with abusive and violent tendencies towards children, rather than regarding ourselves as having those tendencies. We're getting with the parents in Hansel and Gretel who are hungry and therefore abandon their children in the woods because they can't work hard enough to provide for them properly. The reason we need to tell ourselves these stories is because we need to be sure that we're not those people. We need to differentiate ourselves from those people and make out that we are much more loving and careful as parents.
Some have interpreted these stories as cautionary tales. Little Red Riding Hood tells us to obey our elders, beware the woods, and be cautious of strangers from beyond our homes. Others have taken a more psychoanalytic approach. Employing the concepts of Sigmund Freud, these interpretations recast the story as one of sexual awakening. The dark woods are a symbol of the unconscious mind. Obedient and innocent, she is the archetypal female. The wolf, on the other hand, hungry and aggressive, is the male. When they meet later at the grandmother's house, Little Red Riding Hood recognizes the wolf in his disguise, but does not flee. Instead, she climbs into bed with him. The scene is a seduction, and Little Red Riding Hood is a willing participant.
Fairy tales, like all stories, have an element of content which is not explicit on the surface. Psychoanalysts have also argued that fairy tales communicate to us at the level of the unconscious. In particular, they communicate to children at the unconscious level.
In real life, wolves very rarely attack human beings. They're actually quite sensible animals. So it follows, therefore, that wolves must be symbolic rather than representing an actual threat. What they seem to represent, it's the fear that human beings who live in woods might become wild and wood-like. They represent this sort of savage interior that has to be carefully contained, controlled, and muzzled by civilization.
If the wolf is a symbol of the wildness lurking within us all, then its frequent presence in these stories is a reminder that however grandly we build our monuments, however elegantly we draft our laws, civilization is ultimately a fiction, a veneer far thinner than we would like to admit. The smallest of slips can see it crack and set loose that savage interior, that wolf, in terrifying fashion. Hurtling through bush and trees, Actaeon's hounds streamed after him as never before. The transformed huntsman urged his unfamiliar limbs on. Close behind was Blackfoot Melampus, swift as the wind. Beside him, Snatcher, fiercest of all, and Shepherd, his favourite, who knew not his master's call. Actaeon crashed on through the woods, but the trees closed tight around him. There was nowhere left to run. On every side, the ravenous dogs surrounded their dear master. Teeth sank into flesh, tearing and slicing, ripping and biting. So they ended the life of Actaeon and slaked the goddess's rage. Actaeon's grisly death comes a long way from home, deep in the wilderness that was the untamed forest. His story is one of the most famous and enduring in all Greek mythology. It has inspired writers, sculptors, and artists in generation after generation. But though the age of the ancient Greeks is long past, our fascination with the wild unknown remains undimmed. Throughout history, societies have used the wilderness to explore what frightens us about the world and about ourselves, to help us understand what it means to be part of a family, part of a community, and what it means to lose those things.
The wilderness is, in some respects, the opposite of civilization, but also there's a sense in which we carry a bit of wildness in ourselves as well.
The wilderness also becomes a place for exploring what happens when humans get too civilized. What does it mean when we go too far, where we start sort of becoming too artificial and too false?
It might be the mountains, it might be the heath. It's the place where, because you haven't got a big rational take on it, you can fill it with the irrational, the parts of yourself that you normally repress or crush.
It continually calls to us as being untamed, and we are drawn by the lure of taming it, but it will never actually give in to our control.
Today, perhaps we like to think we pushed the wilderness back, but though our cities may now stretch to the horizon, we can never banish the wilderness entirely. We can sense it in the silence of a deserted wood, or in the roar of a storm breaking over a distant mountainside. But it is with us always. Our maps may grow ever more detailed, but the wild unknown will always lurk at the edges.